All right, strap in, everyone, because we are diving headfirst into a Hollywood feud that's got everyone talking.
Oh, this one's a doozy.
Justin Baldoni versus Blake Lively, and
Big names.
huge $250 million lawsuit, rumors of smear campaigns.
Oh, yeah.
We've got conflicting stories left and right.
He said, she said.
Exactly.
Classic.
To make sense of it all, we're turning to, well, two sources. One, a very opinionated Reddit thread dissecting every single detail.
Oh, I love this kind of stuff.
They do. And then a Variety article that really breaks down the legal situation.
So what's so fascinating about this case? I think it really pulls back the curtain on the whole Hollywood PR machine. You've got these A-listers, their reputations, their careers.
Millions of dollars at stake.
Millions, exactly.
Okay, let's start with the lawsuit itself. Baldoni is taking the New York Times to court. His claim is that they essentially became Lively's mouthpiece.
Interesting.
They published accusations without, doing their due diligence, fact-checking, giving them a chance to respond.
See, that's where things get really tricky, legally speaking. The New York Times article, it relies heavily on a complaint that Lively filed
Okay.
with the California Civil Rights Department. And these complaints, they're usually confidential.
Right.
So that raises the question, how did this information get out?
That's a good question.
Yeah, this case could force a conversation about how we handle leaks, especially with these high-profile individuals involved.
Baldoni's also claiming that Lively used these accusations to kind of gain control over It Ends With Us, the film they were working on.
Oh, wow.
He even alleges that Ryan Reynolds, Lively's husband, went on like a tirade during a meeting.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's not all.
Mm-hmm.
The lawsuit also claims that Lively's team, they basically went on the offensive, trying to plant negative stories about Baldoni to make him look bad.
Now, if this is true, it really shows you the dark side of Hollywood PR. It's all about trying to control the narrative, even if it means, discrediting your opponent.
So what is that, a smear campaign?
That's exactly what it is, and it raises some serious ethical questions about how far people are willing to go to protect their image.
Meanwhile, the Reddit thread is going crazy.
Oh, I bet.
Some are Team Baldoni, some are Team Lively, and some are just completely confused.
Right.
One thing that really jumped out at me was this alleged list of 30 demands that Lively made during the production.
Oh, yeah. That's a big point of contention. Baldoni insists this list never existed, while Lively's side claims it's completely legitimate.
So, who do you believe?
It's hard to say. It really shows you the power of storytelling. Each side presents their own version of events, and without hard proof, it becomes a battle of who can tell the most convincing story.
And the Variety article mentioned that the lawsuit also alleges that Lively's publicist tried to plant a story specifically targeting Baldoni's faith.
Wow, so personal.
So personally, like nothing is off limits in this PR war.
Right, and what's so interesting here is how this alleged smear campaign goes beyond just refuting allegations. It's about attacking his character.
Makes you wonder, what's truth and what's just strategic maneuvering?
It's a good question. The lawsuit actually claims that the text messages being used as evidence, they've been taken out of context.
Give me an example.
Okay, so Lively supposedly objected to some sex scenes Baldoni wanted in the film, but then later texted him saying her character's clothes should be much sexier. So it makes you wonder, are we getting the full picture here?
Yeah.
Or just snippets carefully chosen to support each side's story?
The Variety article has this quote that I think really sums up the stakes. It says, by filing a lawsuit, Baldoni, Nathan, and Abel appear ready to see the full contents of their text messages and inboxes laid bare in a discovery process.
It's risky.
It sounds like they're willing to risk everything to clear their names.
It is risky. The discovery process, that means both sides have to hand over all relevant documents, evidence. Who knows what could come out? This case could expose way more than just the initial allegations. We might get a glimpse into Hollywood deals, creative clashes, how personal relationships can influence professional decisions.
Speaking of those relationships, the lawsuit paints Ryan Reynolds in a not-so-flattering light.
Really?
Apparently a producer who was at a meeting at Lively and Reynolds' penthouse said they'd never seen anyone speak to another person the way Reynolds allegedly spoke to Baldoni.
Wow. That's a pretty strong statement, especially coming from someone who was supposedly there. It makes you think, did those power dynamics play a role in everything that happened?
And to make things even more concerning, the Sony representative at that same meeting said her only regret was not stepping in to stop Reynolds.
Oh, wow.
That suggests like a level of intimidation, a
Yeah.
power imbalance. It's unsettling.
Absolutely. This detail really highlights those unspoken hierarchies in Hollywood. If someone representing a major studio felt like they couldn't intervene, it makes you wonder how much influence those in power really have.
Okay, so we have this tangled mess of
Yeah.
allegations, legal back and forth, behind the scenes drama. But before we go any further, let's check back in with the Reddit thread. What are people saying about the impact on Baldoni's career?
Well, Reddit is buzzing about the fact that Baldoni was dropped by his agency, WME, just hours after that New York Times article came out.
Oh, wow, that's fast.
It is. And it shows how quickly these kinds of accusations can have devastating consequences.
So even if the allegations are proven false later, the damage is done.
Exactly. It's the court of public opinion. Reputations can be tarnished in an instant. News travels fast, and sometimes the damage is done before all the facts are even known.
And what about Lively? Is she facing any scrutiny after Baldoni filed this lawsuit?
Oh, definitely. The Reddit threads are filled with discussions about how this could affect Lively's upcoming projects. Some are even speculating that studios might be hesitant to work with her now.
Fearing the controversy.
Exactly.
So it's like the tables have turned. Lively seemed to have the upper hand initially, and now she's also facing potential consequences.
It's a reminder that even in Hollywood, where power and influence seem to be everything, actions have consequences. This case is a perfect example of how quickly things can shift.
This whole thing started as a behind-the-scenes disagreement, and now it's a full-blown public battle. It seems like both sides are determined to see this through to the very end.
And it's not just a battle between two individuals. This case has the potential to reshape the relationship between Hollywood, the media, and the public. It's forcing us to ask tough questions about how we handle accusations, the role of PR, and the impact of these scandals on the entire industry.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much to unpack. We'll be back to dissect the juicy details from the Variety article and those passionate Reddit threads. Stay tuned. Okay, so we're back, and this Hollywood showdown between Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively just keeps getting more and more complicated. Remember those text messages, the ones that seem to paint Baldoni in a bad light? Well, the Variety article actually goes into how those messages even came to light.
Yeah, it's a whole legal thing. Lively's lawyers admitted they got the messages through a subpoena
Oh, okay.
to Baldoni's former publicist, Stephanie Jones. But Baldoni is claiming that that subpoena wasn't valid, especially because of Jones' involvement in how she got those messages in the first place.
So maybe some shady stuff going on behind the scenes.
Could be. And it gets even more complicated. The lawsuit claims that Abel, who's also being sued by the New York Times, had to hand over her electronic devices when she left Jones's PR firm. If that's true, it raises some serious concerns about how people's personal data is being handled.
Especially with these professional rivalries and everything.
Exactly. It's about ethical boundaries and whether those were crossed to get information. We have to remember, reputations are on the line, and how you get that information can be just as important as the information itself.
And speaking of reputations, the lawsuit goes on to detail how Baldoni's career basically tanked after the New York Times article. He was dropped by his agency, WME, just hours after it was published.
Wow, that's brutal. It shows how much power the media has. Even if those accusations are later proven false, the damage is already done.
It's like a game of telephone. The truth gets distorted with each retelling. And it seems like the New York Times might have played a role in that distortion. The lawsuit says they contacted Baldoni for a response at like 9:46 p.m. on a Friday,
Oh, wow.
right before a holiday, giving him just 14 hours to respond. And then they published the article 2 hours earlier than they said they would.
If that's all true, it definitely makes you question their motives. Were they really trying to get both sides of the story, or were they just after a sensational headline?
So this begs the question, will the New York Times be held liable for libel?
It's hard to say. Libel is a tough thing to prove, especially when you're dealing with public figures.
Right, it's not just about publishing something false. You have to prove they knew it was false or acted recklessly.
Exactly. And this case isn't just about Baldoni and Lively. It raises questions about journalistic ethics, fact-checking, presenting a balanced perspective. It reminds us that we, as readers and viewers, need to think critically and not take everything we read as fact.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the impact this whole controversy might have on It Ends With Us. According to Variety, the film ended up being a huge box office hit, over $351 million worldwide.
Wow.
Makes you wonder, did all the drama actually help the movie?
Maybe. You know what they say? No such thing as bad publicity. Sometimes controversy can create a buzz, get people talking, and ultimately lead to more ticket sales.
Yeah, I guess all that attention, even if it was negative, might have made people curious.
It's definitely possible. It shows that the connection between controversy and success isn't always so straightforward.
Okay, back to that Reddit thread for a second, because there's a new development that everyone's talking about.
Oh, what now?
Blake Lively filed a lawsuit. Someone posted a TMZ article saying she's suing Baldoni and Wayfarer Studios, claiming emotional distress and mental anguish.
Wow, so this is far from over. It shows there are always multiple sides to a story, and sometimes the search for truth can be a real roller coaster. With both of them going to court, it'll be interesting to see what kind of evidence comes out and how the legal system makes sense of it all.
It's like a legal chess match. Each move is calculated to try and get the upper hand. So what do you make of Lively's decision to countersue?
Seems like a strategic move. She's taking the offensive, putting Baldoni on the defensive. It's basically her saying, I'm not just going to sit here and let him attack my character. I'm going to fight back.
It adds another layer of complexity to the whole who's telling the truth question.
Yeah.
It's going to be fascinating to see how this all unfolds, but one thing's for sure, this is going to be a long road to justice.
Absolutely. And this case has implications beyond just Baldoni and Lively. It could affect the whole dynamic between Hollywood, the media, and the public. It's about power dynamics, accountability, and the influence the media has on how we see the world.
Before we move on, I want to go back to something we mentioned earlier about the intimacy coordinator on It Ends With Us. The Variety article said the coordinator suggested that Baldoni's character, Ryle, shouldn't have an orgasm after satisfying Lively's character, Lily.
That's interesting. It shows how the role of intimacy coordinators is evolving. They're not just there for safety. They also have a say in the story, making sure intimate scenes are handled with respect.
And according to the lawsuit, Lively apparently said she'd be mortified if that happened to her in real life. Baldoni, maybe trying to connect with her, responded by saying that similar things had happened in his marriage and they were beautiful moments.
That's tricky territory. It shows how hard it can be to separate personal boundaries from professional expectations, especially when you're dealing with sensitive topics like intimacy.
It also makes you wonder if those kinds of personal comments contributed to the tension on set.
It's definitely possible. When you mix sensitive topics like intimacy and relationships with work, it's easy for things to get blurry.
This whole case is a reminder that even in Hollywood, with all its glamour and perfection, there are still real people with flaws. And sometimes those flaws can lead to very public and messy conflicts.
Well said. Behind all the glitz and glamour, Hollywood is still a business. And like any business, it's driven by power, ambition, and the desire to succeed.
Okay, we've uncovered a lot of information. What are your main takeaways so far? What should our listeners be paying attention to as this whole saga continues?
I think the biggest thing is to remember that we can't always believe what we see or hear. There are always multiple sides, and fighting the truth isn't always easy. This case shows how information can be manipulated and twisted to fit someone's agenda.
It's like we have pieces of a puzzle and we're trying to figure out the full picture. And the stakes are high. Baldoni is suing for $250 million. If he wins, it could change how the media reports on these kinds of stories.
Definitely. This case could set a precedent for how we deal with allegations, especially when big names are involved. It's a reminder that responsible journalism is important, that facts matter, and that everyone deserves to have their side of the story heard.
This situation also shows how much influence PR has. Both sides seem to have used some questionable tactics.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we should always be critical of what we read and hear, especially when it comes to narratives that seem too perfect or one-sided.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground today. When we come back for the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore the potential consequences of this case and what it might mean for the future of Hollywood. Stick around. Okay, so we've dug into the lawsuit, looked at the accusations, and even explored the PR battle. Now let's zoom out for a second. What impact could this whole thing have on Hollywood? I mean, beyond Baldoni and Lively.
Well, think of it this way, like a ripple effect. You throw a rock in a pond. Those ripples, they spread out. In this case, it could really shake things up in Hollywood. Everything from how studios choose projects to how actors and directors, handle things on set.
So you're saying this could be a turning point for the industry?
It's definitely possible. For one thing, studios might be more hesitant about working with people who, have a history of controversy, because at the end of the day, they want to make money. And a big PR nightmare, that can really hurt a film's success.
Makes sense. No studio wants to be caught up in a scandal, especially when there's so much money at stake.
Exactly. And this whole situation, it might make actors and directors less likely to speak out about problems on set. Nobody wants to risk their career
Right.
or become the target of a smear campaign, especially if they're going up against someone powerful.
It's a tough spot to be in. You want to fight for what you believe in, but you also have to protect yourself. This case really shows just how imbalanced the power is in Hollywood. It often feels like those at the top, they have all the protection.
That's true. And there's another layer to consider, the hashtag #MeToo movement. If Baldoni wins this libel suit against the New York Times, it could make the media much more cautious about reporting on these kinds of allegations.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. We want to encourage victims to come forward, hold people accountable. But at the same time, accusations need to be carefully investigated. Everyone deserves a fair process. This case has the potential to tip the scales one way or another.
It's a tricky balance, that's for sure. And we're already seeing how this is playing out in the public eye. Just look at the Reddit thread. It's full of people trying to figure out who to believe. Is it Baldoni or Lively? It's a classic he said, she said, and it's dividing people.
It's wild how social media becomes this platform for dissecting scandals like this. People are weighing the evidence, coming to their own conclusions, like a jury deliberation, but happening online in real time.
And the constant media coverage doesn't help. Every little detail, every legal move gets analyzed and debated. It reminds us that we can't just blindly accept everything we read. We have to be critical, question those narratives that seem too perfect or too one-sided.
Well said. So this case is far from over. The stakes are incredibly high. Remember, Baldoni's suing the New York Times for $250 million if he wins. It could change how the media handles these kinds of stories forever.
Absolutely. It could embolden others to fight back against what they see as unfair or biased reporting. This could be a turning point.
And we can't forget about Lively. If Baldoni proves she was behind a smear campaign, her reputation could be seriously damaged. It might be harder for her to get roles in the future.
Image is everything in Hollywood. Even a little bit of scandal can have a lasting effect. This case could have huge long-term consequences for both of their careers.
So after this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What should they keep in mind as this story unfolds?
I think the biggest takeaway is that Hollywood is a complicated place. You've got power dynamics, big ambitions, tangled relationships. This case reminds us that things aren't always what they seem. There are always things happening behind the scenes, agendas at play.
It's a cautionary tale. It highlights the importance of clear communication, having solid contracts in place, and maybe approaching those professional relationships with a little bit of skepticism.
I agree. And even in the glamorous world of Hollywood, conflicts happen. It's unavoidable. But the key is to deal with those conflicts in a professional and constructive way. Don't let them escalate into these huge public battles that can hurt everyone involved.
And as this case moves forward, what are some things our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, first, remember that there are always multiple perspectives. The truth is often somewhere in the middle, not black and white. Don't jump to conclusions based on a single narrative. Be skeptical, especially if it sounds too perfect or one-sided.
That's good advice. What else?
Pay attention to the evidence. Look at the documents, the testimonies, the communications that are presented in court. See how that evidence is interpreted. The outcome of this case will likely depend on those crucial details.
And finally,
think about the bigger picture. How might this case impact the future of Hollywood? How could it affect the media and the way we talk about power dynamics and holding people accountable?
this case has the potential to change things. It's definitely worth keeping an eye on. This deep dive has been a wild ride, a simple lawsuit turning into this huge mess of accusations and PR moves. It shows that even in the entertainment world, the stakes can be incredibly high, and the consequences can be long-lasting. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be following the story closely and bring you any updates as they happen.